Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Brotherless Night.
I virtually attended your wedding a little while ago, and it was a Hindu ceremony, which I thought was very cool. But it also made me wonder, are you a practicing Hindu? To what extent was that ceremony like a cultural tradition, and to what extent was it part of your ongoing religious practice?
Yeah, it was definitely cultural. I'm not religious. I would identify myself as like a Hindu atheist. What about you? You've talked about
What are you talking about? What
you
is
you
that?
you can you can be culturally Hindu without being someone who necessarily believes, just like, you can find Jewish atheists.
Okay. Is that
So
all?
what about you?
Well, I'm not super religious. My wife's Jewish, so I did know, actually, when we were getting married, I went and talked to the rabbi, and he's like, you could be an atheist and be Jewish. And I was like, I did not know that was an option. Very interesting. Not an option in Christianity, which is where I was brought up. I've recently found out that my parents do listen to the podcast pretty faithfully, so I'm trying to be, I don't know, a little nicer about how I talk about religion. But let's just say generally, I'm not convinced
By what?
by anything. That doesn't mean that I don't think that religion is an important and fascinating topic, and it is, and it has also been a driving force behind our politics and some of our best literature. And it's inextricably connected to the way we think about race in America today. And so today we're going to talk to a novelist who has managed to cross all of these streams to make a godless Ghostbusters reference in his debut novel.
Jeff Boyd is a former public school teacher from Chicago and a recent graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he received the Dina Davidson Friedman Prize for Fiction. His first novel, The Wait, was just released April 11th from Simon & Schuster. The book is a powerful coming-of-age novel about a 20-something Black musician living in predominantly white Portland, Oregon. He plays in a rock band on the verge of success while struggling with racism, romance, and the legacy of his own strict religious upbringing. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hi, Wendy Sugi. Thanks for having me.
So, in your novel, The Wait, the main character, Julian Strickland, comes from a deeply religious background in Illinois and carries the remains of that upbringing with him to the Pacific Northwest. And he says, and I'm quoting here, "The way I grew up, I was a Christian before I was Black or American or anything else." So the character doesn't have to have this past. Why did you choose this for him?
Well, I guess there's a couple of reasons. One is I somewhat share that past, so I thought, okay, I can, but I think it's, I guess just this idea that not only is he leaving his home, he's also kind of leaving his faith in a sense, or at least his strongly held beliefs are kind of shaken. And he did. I guess I found it interesting that this idea that that he really does take like this idea of like Christian brotherhood or family to the point that faith or shared religious beliefs and his Christianity was more important in his connection to other people as well than race or anything else was. So that's kind of the lens that he viewed his life from. But now that that's been shattered, it kind of leaves him in a place where he has to kind of cope with who he is kind of on multiple levels. It's not just the racial lines, it's also like kind of that religious line that he's no longer able to go along with.
We have a lot of students. I've taught with a lot of students at UMKC here in Missouri who are coming from religious backgrounds, interestingly enough, usually from the Midwest. Julian, the name of the character, the main character, Julian Strickland, reads Baldwin, whose first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, was about his life in a religious family. We had Monica West on this podcast a while back, and her novel Revival Season was about the same thing. But your narrator has like left that world. So it's not really about living in that world, right? It's about post that world. And yet his Christian past sort of provides this sometimes funny, sometimes weird connection for him with the white world of Portland. Can you talk a little bit about that and read to us from the book?
Sure. Yeah. So, he is trying to escape that kind of strict religious upbringing he's had. He's kind of trying to, you know, get away from those, I guess, groups of people who, you know, would identify primarily as Christian, and that being like their, you know, main driver. And I think that's also, it kind of complicates it that at work, he's working at a Christian workplace. So unbeknownst to him, you know, and I do think that, and the same thing as kind of growing up a religious, that in a church, a lot of the times you're kind of taught that, you know, race doesn't really matter. Nothing else matters except for your kind of belief in God and that you're God's child. And I think Julian kind of gets that. So he was able to relate to his Christian boss and Christian workers by saying like, hey, like, I know I'm the only Black guy here, but we're all Christians, right? You know, so I think he sees that as a tool, one of the tools that he has to kind of feel, or at least let the people working with him feel like he belongs, or that he demands respect in the same way they respect the others, because they all have this religious belief.
That's really interesting to me, because and you're going to read this passage, but I just want to respond to that in a second, because my dad was very religious. And one of the things that doesn't get talked a lot about when you talk about religion, because very often it's framed in a sort of far right wing way, was that, you know, my dad's primary interracial friendships came through Christianity. Like, he was really close friends with Emmanuel Cleaver, who's now the congressional representative from our district, but they became friends at the YMCA, you know, and through sort of interfaith organizations, right? And I just thought that was an interesting part of your book that I hadn't seen someone write about before.
Yeah, like I think I also kind of felt that. I also feel like that's what people, I do think that kind of somewhat of like Christian goodwill has kind of been hijacked by this kind of very right-wing idea. And there is kind of that beauty that comes from the shared faith and being able to relate to people from across the aisle or different backgrounds because of that kind of shared vision of the world and of the afterlife. So yeah, that was kind of something I so I guess I'll read a passage from the book. Yes, this part, so like I said, Julian, this is the first time we encountered Julian at work, and he's kind of telling us about the first time he realized that maybe he shouldn't have taken this job if he's trying to leave his past. And so, yeah, so he's talking to one of his coworkers on a boat about whether or not there's going to be drinks on the boat. And after hearing from his coworker, this is kind of Julian giving us a summary of what he learned, and then kind of going back into his normal day at work. So turns out everyone else who worked in our office were the guys the boss had met in the Christian AA group he led. Trenton and I had been hired under unique circumstances. Trenton had cold called the boss 2 years ago to sell him on the high-speed internet business package he was peddling. And the boss had been so blown away by Trenton's skills, he convinced him to join the sales team at Marketing Monkey. My job was only one the boss ever put an ad out for. Before this job, I'd only worked in retail. My resume was light. I think he hired me because I graduated from a Christian college. But escaping a Christian environment was part of the reason I'd left Illinois in the first place. I should have quit when we got back to shore. I should have quit the moment I found out the boss had the whole company pray together every Monday. But over a year later, I was still on the job because I couldn't afford to miss a paycheck. I had so much student loan debt that the total balance seemed like an error. My 2 credit cards were close to maxed out. After Trenton left my cubicle, I spun my chair back to my computer and tried to figure out how I was going to make myself look busy. I scrolled through my work emails looking for something hard to respond to, so if the boss walked by my desk and asked what I was doing, I could tell him I was providing customer service. I was the only Marketing Monkey employee paid hourly. I was the only one who wasn't in sales. I received about 3 calls an hour. The company's website and email marketing system were built and maintained by an independent contractor. I made $16 an hour with limited benefits, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. I answered the phone, reluctantly replied to emails, and co-wrote and edited the boss's weekly newsletter. I thought about the Baldwin I read before work. I thought about what he said about Black people being born in the ghetto, destined to die in the ghetto. But that wasn't me. I was born in the suburbs. I was raised to be able to make something of myself. And here I was, making shit pay and being poor. My desk phone lit up right before lunch. The boss said he needed to see me immediately. He reminded me of a megachurch youth pastor I used to know, especially on Fridays when he wore jeans and shirts that were too tight, distressed, and European for his age, body, and worldview. His thinning hair was meticulously styled and colored. His slang felt forced. He was condescending, loud, self-righteous, muscular only in arms and chest. I walked into his office. Julian, the boss said, my homie, shut the door and sit down. With his hands out of sight, I thought maybe he was holding that handgun I'd heard he kept in the locked desk drawer and that he was deciding whether to pull the trigger. I could never tell what he was thinking, and he never let on until he was ready for the reveal. He looked sort of happy to see me, but also like he somehow found out that Trent and I had pounded vodka energy drinks at the park across the street during lunch break on Monday. Or maybe he'd caught me staring at his eldest daughter's butt when she came in on Tuesday to surprise him for his birthday. I tried not to look at the framed high school graduation photo sitting on the shelf behind him. Feeling better, he asked. He put his meaty hands on the top of his desk. They were empty. He was a maniac. I sat in the chair across from him. It was a nasty bug, I said, but I'm feeling much better. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's such a good scene. Julian is reading Baldwin. And one of the great things about Julian is that he is a reader, and he's always kind of referencing this mental vocabulary that he has of like, who am I like? Who am I not like? What are my aspirations? He's reading Baldwin, but he knows that he's not exactly like Baldwin. And he's also very different from his boss. But the boss reminds him of a pastor he used to know. Though our former professor, Jim McPherson, once wrote about looking for, and I'm quoting here, a model of identity that might help me transcend, at least in my thinking, a provisional or racial identity. How would Julian react to that idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, James Allen McPherson was gone by the time I got to Iowa, but his presence looms large, as I say. So I appreciate his work, and also just how many people he's touched that I've met. But I do think, as far as the quote, a model of identity that might help me transcend, at least in my thinking, provisional or racial identity. I do think Julian that's kind of what he's searching for. That's part of his journey. And I think that's also kind of related to his loss of the main identity he had, which is, his being a kind of a good Christian with a strong faith and someone who went to church, 3 days a week. So, I mean, that's who he was. So that's, but now he doesn't have that. And he also, I don't think, does feel comfortable being seen only as being Black. So it's all kind of tied into this idea that he wants to be seen for who he is. And I think the idea is like, who am I? If I want to be seen for who I am, then who am I? If he wants to transcend all these things, then what is he transcending it with? I think that's kind of his journey here.
I know you didn't study with Jim, but that line comes from an essay called "On Becoming an American Writer," and we interviewed. We had a podcast about a book of essay collections that had that essay in it, and it's also in his book, "A Region Not Home." But I felt throughout the book like that project of trying to invent a new identity, a very American thing, but a very Ellisonian and McPhersonian thing, right? Is what the book is really processing. And, the setting has a lot to do with that. Julian has a complicated relationship to Portland, Oregon. He calls the neighborhood that he's in a refuge from all things evil and hard, which seems nice. But at the same time, he says, everywhere I went, I was the Black guy. So what's it like for a character to live in a neighborhood they love, but at the same time feel like they don't belong?
Yeah, I think that kind of complicated things for him. I think it also is why he stays no matter what happens. I think he's like, well, like this place is great. Like he, on a daily basis, he, there's things that he appreciates about it. He has friends that he appreciates. He has kind of like-minded people in that sense. But I do think there are times, he's not removed from the world or from the American culture. So I think it's hard to kind of, and I've talked to friends about this too, like even living in Portland, because I did live there, and sitting
How long did you live there?
10 years.
Yeah.
So I from like 2006 to 2016. And so yeah, it's like, oh, like just like my white friends, it's like just imagine if everyone around you all of a sudden, like snap your fingers, everyone around you is Black, like. Even if you're having the same time like you just visually, like it's just, you can't escape it. It's like Julian doesn't even when he doesn't want to think about being the only Black person around, it's just natural human being. Like you're going to notice that no one is like you. It's like, it's like when you're trying to play a game with a kid, like one of these things is not like the other, or you having them separate things. Like it's just your mind's going to get drawn to that, at least sometimes. And when that does happen, it's hard for it not to be like, well, why is it this way? Like, since I'm not like everyone else, should I be here? It's like, it doesn't, there's this feeling of like this unnatural feeling that comes even if you're having that nice serene time. Like at some point he's going to open his eyes and look in the room and be like, oh man, like I'm the only Black guy here. Like, and that changes the way, you feel like you can, maybe if you did let your guard down, it almost kind of immediately makes you put your guard back up. It's just as a means of survival, I think.
As I was reading, I was thinking about AWP in Portland, which was maybe the last time I was there. And my kind of like, it's like, oh, I'm so excited to be here in this progressive place with all of its natural beauty. And also, I mean, exactly what you're describing. And it also, I mean, Whitney, the question that you ask, what is it like for a character to live in a neighborhood they love, but where they feel like they don't belong? I feel like it could just as easily be I'm in Minneapolis, Jeff, and it just seems like it could also be a very Minnesotan question.
Yeah.
So it's something that you portray really beautifully.
There's also this really wonderful subplot with Claire and Peter, who are the neighbors who live across the street and have an adopted son who is Black named Reggie. And so they, of course, immediately approach Julian, and he thinks that they want to be friends at first, but really they just want him to hang out with their kid because he's the other Black guy that they know. And that becomes but their relationship is complicated. They do things that hurt his feelings, but they also grow and change with him. And I thought that was one of the interesting things about the novel was the way that Julian negotiated complicated relationships. One single incident or a case of misunderstanding doesn't end his relationship with people. He kind of tends to work through that.
Yeah. And I think that also does tie back to the faith thing. I guess he doesn't say it explicitly in the book, but my idea is that he kind of does kind of feel like only God can judge. He's not like in the business of judging people, for better or worse. I think sometimes that gets him in trouble, and sometimes it, helps him. So I think that's kind of related to this relationship that he has with them, is that he can see like, okay, like, yeah, like if I had a Black kid and I was living in this neighborhood and everyone else around me was white, I might feel like maybe my kid should get to know some other people who, look similar. So he doesn't feel like he's the only Black person here. Maybe this person can give in. So I think Julian kind of gets that to the extent he does feel kind of hurt by the fact that it doesn't feel like a genuine relationship at first. Feels kind of not transactional, but like these people kind of want something from him. They don't want to give him anything back. I think he does feel hurt by that. But I think he also sees that Reggie, the character Reggie, who's an adopted 14-year-old, like I guess 14-year-old in the book, that Reggie can use his guidance. And I think Julian can also kind of get something from Reggie. He doesn't have to feel alone when the two of them are playing basketball. For instance, there's these two Black guys kind of there in this world, but they're not alone. And I think it also does with Claire and Peter. Julian starts to kind of, I guess they both kind of start to influence each other in ways that help them kind of see maybe, at least, Claire and Peter, the bias that they hold. I think, but I don't think that they're also naturally, I think that is kind of related to Portland, is that a lot of people are liberal and well-meaning, but I don't think they get to like practice what that means because they don't have to. You know what I mean? It's like, it's like they have these great feelings.
I'm theoretically well-meaning.
Yeah, theoretically. Yeah, and I think it's also related to, I think this book kind of takes place before the Black Lives Matter movement, but a few years after this, Julian's going to walk around the street and they're going to have a lot of Black Lives Matter signs on either side. And he's going to say, so you're telling me I matter, like, thank you, like, because there's no one else to read that who, it's just like, it was different than that. Like, it's like so I think that it's also like we have Claire and Peter who do have these kind of well-meaning intentions for their son and for the world, but they never really have to practice it. So they're very, that being out of practice, you kind of see how the bumps along the way.
Can I ask, did you start writing this book while you lived in Portland, or was it something that you had to begin with a little bit of distance?
Yeah, I definitely started it almost as soon as I moved to Chicago. I moved back to Chicago and I was like, here we go, what can I write about? Yeah.
I feel that what you're describing, there are also like, and I've written about Kansas City's neighborhoods, and it has a lot of racial segregation. Like, so I would jog or ride my bike through what I know to be a very, very white neighborhood. And you see all the Black Lives Matter signs. You're like, who are they saying that to? I guess each other. I don't know.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
did. But if you're doing it, for instance, in rural Oregon or rural Minnesota, for instance, that's a real statement. You know, you're
Yeah.
standing up against people who do not feel the same way as you, even if they look the same. So I think that's, yeah, I think that's also, yeah, kind of the feeling is that these, I guess we'll probably talk more about this, but it's a place where people do kind of hold a lot of strong, kind of liberal beliefs. But since it doesn't come to their life or come into their practice, they don't have to contend with it until they have to deal, in this case, have to deal with Julian. Yeah.
So, Jeff, you open the novel with a quote from the 1857 Oregon Constitution that says, and here's the quote, "No free Negro shall ever come, trade, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate." So this seems even more extreme than the racial covenants that Whitney has written about in Kansas City, which prevented Black Americans from owning property in certain neighborhoods. So how did Oregon go from that kind of maximalist racism to being a reliably, quote, woke democratic state, or has it really changed?
Yeah. Well, I do think it's changed quite a bit, at least as far as their laws are concerned. I think the last law excluding blacks from Oregon wasn't repealed like officially until 1926. So it is kind of like a recent history. And I think maybe what has, well, especially Portland, how Portland has changed is that the reason that and I guess the reason that I have that quote, or I know it so readily, is because when I was a teacher, like I taught language arts and like social studies, like that's like in our public school curriculum. Like we're like, I guess it's one of the reasons people try to fight this as a woke place. It's like they do try to teach kids the history of the place that they're living in, trying to understand this place used to be very, excluding to different groups. We had this laws in the books. And so I think that also kind of helped the shift, like I said, so where people can say, okay, like I understand that this is the way this community used to be, like, yeah, but it's changed a lot. I think it's just like any other place. Portland's a big liberal city, and so that and the surrounding areas kind of also taken that on. That, yeah, those understandings.
So I just referenced Oregon as reliably woke, but so 74% of the population is white and under 6% is Black. And the more rural eastern part of the state has been home to a number of white supremacy groups. So what's your take on that? Is Oregon reliably blue, or is there a chance that it turns out to be, dear God, I'm so disappointed in Iowa. It turns out to be an Iowa or Missouri, states that were once reliably Democratic, but turned deep red?
Yeah. So like I said, having lived in Illinois, I feel like it's kind of similar in that sense. Like the city is what makes it liberal, in the suburbs. And I do think that for the most part, Portland and the surrounding areas takes a big enough portion of the population where hopefully, well, to me anyway, hopefully it'll stay democratic. But I do think you see them pushing up against each other a lot more now. You see a lot of maybe those rural groups coming into Portland, like kind of to assert themselves, because that really is kind of where the fight is. I mean, because there's such a stronghold of the woke liberal idea, like that's in Portland. So I think it's why the Proud Boys and all those people also trying to come in and fight, because they want to do that where they live. Like people are gonna just say, yeah, we agree with you, but it's not gonna make a change. So I do think Portland kind of becomes this hotbed where a lot of issues are kind of wrestled with. But I think the reason that happens there is because it does have such a stronghold. I don't think that'll, knock on wood, I think Portland should stay reliably Democratic for quite a while.
We're going to need those votes, I'm telling you.
Yeah.
All right. Can we talk about the band? I was in a band. Sugi used to be in a band and is about to join another. This is new, Sugi. I thought you were still in a band. What happened to your band?
The pandemic killed my band.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was the Sun Ra band?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Damn
It
it.
was very
How
sad.
could a band like that die?
Sounds nice.
Were you in a band, Jeff?
Yeah. I did. Like I played in church too, so I play the bass mostly. So yeah, I mean, Portland, that was my first big kind of connection, and I think that's also why I give that to Julian, because it is kind of like a grounding. I don't know. Let's start with.
No, I
What
mean,
am I saying?
within the band friendships are great. That's what, I mean, some of my sweetest moments of high school for me was when I was in this band, were the time that I spent with my bandmates who are still my friends, and the goofy shit that we would talk about and do with each other, and the way we had to deal with each other's foibles and not wanting to carry this amp and not showing up on time for practice. I mean, all those things it's beautiful, I think, in the way
Yeah.
that he develops connections with those guys. Did you have
How did
similar
he?
relationships with your bandmates?
Yeah, I did. No, I think that my bands, like especially the band that I played in the longest in Portland, like, we would go on North American tours for like 2 months. Like after you do that, like you are, your brothers for life. And I think I am, I do feel that way about those guys. Like we are, yeah, they're like even when I don't talk to them, they're like the family, like they're like the brother that I don't call. It's like I should call him. It's my brother. It's like yeah, it's just such a strong connection that you kind of get from growing up and having the same goal. Like you want to make good music, you want to like express yourself. Especially for me growing like back then, like a job was just secondary to like having enough money to pay rent and being able to go to the bar and being able to play music. Like that was the goal. Like the art was the goal, and everything around it is just survival. And I think, especially when you're in a group of people who feel the same way, like it's almost, yeah. I mean, you're either going to hate each other or love each other, but you're not going to be neutral about those people.
I was reading and remembering all of the bands in which I had been the only woman, which was a lot of them. And I'm also, so Julian's a drummer.
Yeah.
Why?
I I've always liked the drums. I always wish I knew how to play the drums. And one of
Me too.
my best yeah, and my best friend is a drummer. And to tell you the truth, I was like, I'm gonna make this guy a drummer. And he's like, no, you're not. And I was like, you just watch me. It's like it's like, so I think it's almost like a basic rhythm section, not inside, it's more than that, but it's just like I feel like I can understand the mind of a drummer just by having like stood so close to watch the kick drum and the snare and like, just like I feel like I can, even if I can't necessarily, I can play them okay, but even not necessarily a good drummer, like I feel like I understand them. So I was like a drummer, just and it felt like kind of the most earthy thing. Like it doesn't require amplification. I thought about like it's just kind of this kind of, I felt the most, I don't know, the drums are like to me the coolest instrument. Really, they're the coolest thing. I listen to music, like I listen, like especially after writing this book, like I listen to drums. Like, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a bass and guitar in here. I'm just like, listen to that drum beat. Let's like, yeah. Anyway, so I just kind of got obsessed with what it's like to be a drummer. Like as part of my artistic goal as a writer too. It kind of gave me distance to where I
I
couldn't
mean, the other
just.
thing, yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go
Sorry,
for it.
I didn't
No,
mean to
it's
interrupt you.
good.
The other thing about music, of course, is that when you're listening to music, you can't tell what the race is of the person playing it, or even the gender. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
music, right? And there's been a long tradition of, I mean, in Kansas City, there's a place called the Mutual Musicians Foundation, which is dedicated to the first interracial musicians union in America, right? And jazz was a really important like place where Black and white musicians work together on stuff, and I felt like that is part of when we get back to that idea of McPherson's quote that we talked earlier about transcending the provisional or racial identity, that maybe he achieved some of that through the band and through music. I mean, does that seem like a
Yeah,
reasonable
totally.
statement?
Oh yeah, totally. I think that's something I was, like, that I found important, but also Julian finds important in the book, is that yeah, like when you're playing music with people and you're really serious about it, really involved, like you've done all the scheduling and the wrangling and the whatever to get everyone in the room together, that's also a challenge, which is all you have to be like a family, because you have to like, be concerned with everyone else's scheduling. But once you're in there and you're making art, you're making music, it does feel like nothing else matters. Like race does kind of fall away when you're really communicating and playing with other people in that way. it does have that spiritual feeling, which I also feel like that spirituality of it is also what Julian craves, but it's also what his bandmates crave. It's this kind of spiritual communion that doesn't have to do with their religion or their faith or anything really, other than that they both really want to make the best music possible, and when they do it, they feel their best. And I think that feeling is what kind of that Julian has with his bandmates, is why he's able to go through so many things with them, and also why I think he doesn't feel like the only black guy around. Like I don't think he doesn't mention that so much when he's hanging out with his bandmates playing music, because he's not thinking about that. Like he's thinking about the music, or he's not thinking at all. He's simply like in a kind of in a spiritual, I guess, union or communion with these other guys, these other people that that he can't get anywhere else.
So Julian's life is entangled with the lives of his bandmates, and he also is entangled with a few women. So can we talk a little bit about his love life? Who are his lovers? What do they tell us about him, and also about Portland?
Yeah, well, like I said, it's predominantly white. So, and especially, I mean, I think also it doesn't really say in the book, but I mean, Julian's like hanging out with like a bunch of like musician artist types, which is already kind of even whiter, no matter where you are. I mean, as far as like people feel like they have the access or the time or the community to like I'm an artist, like so. Yeah, so I mean, most of the opportunity he had to meet women are at venues or other places. So most of them are white. Most of them are like so going down the kind of people. The first woman he's kind of entangled with in the book is named Anne, and I've always felt like she kind of has the most like. She's not a musician, but she's very Portlandish. She has the look. She has the tattoos. She likes gardening, and I think that talking about talking about belonging, like Julian can, he feels like being with her makes him feel that sort of that he belongs, because he's with someone who belongs in the place.
She's like the unattainable perfect in a certain way for him. It seems like, but can I also ask about, like, later in the book, without giving up too many spoilers, like there are some problems with women among the band. And I was interested in the ways that you managed to, I mean, in some ways this would be the end of the band if bandmates were sleeping with each other's girlfriends, as occurs, but somehow it gets resolved. How did you make that choice?
Well, I guess I thought about what it means to really, like I said, Julian identifies so much with his band. Like these are his, in many ways his brothers. And how far you can get away, how many things you can get away with if you actually really do have that belief. Because when Julian believes, he believes hard. So these are his brothers, these are his bandmates. Nothing can tear them apart. They have multiple, and they, of course, they have many reasons and many times they do almost get torn apart. But at least in his mind, he's like, no, like we have to be here. So I think, I mean, to sum it all up, I would say that I guess I've known people in my life who have been in bands who've had this kind of situation. And I've like, I've known.
What on earth are you talking about?
Like
none of us know about this.
They're in their 20s, they're just living, it's like any decision you make, it's almost like, hey man, like I had a feeling, like, what do you want me to do? It's like, I'm just, let me live, it's like, so you have to kind of contend with that. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is like, is that these things don't always tear people apart. Sometimes it is surprising how someone could do something that you might deem to be bad or horrible from the outside. But when you're in the situation, you can kind of, I guess, see all sides of it, and you can empathize in a way that kind of lets people, I mean, people have done worse to their bandmates, I guess I can say. And they stick to, there's famous examples, and there's just all, everyday examples of people who only play at a bar, once a month with their friends. Like those, like they have their own little shit that they contend with, so they can continue to do that. Yeah.
So I just want to read, there's this little snippet of description of Anne when she first comes in that just made me laugh. Julian says to her, "You're so beautiful." And she says, "Yeah, right. I'm the plainest woman you ever saw." And then here's his interiority. "I looked at her in her weekend gardening clothes and her oversized eyeglasses and considered the owl tattoo she had above her left elbow. decided she was probably right. She looked like a lot of women in Portland, and that was part of the attraction. She belonged in this world just by being herself. And I was just like, oh man, every episode of Portlandia that I've seen is flashing before my eyes. Like,
Yeah.
and then, Julian is he's such a sweet idealist in some ways. Like later in the book, there's this, he's kind of watching Peter and Claire, and he says, they seem to be truly in love, an apple without a worm, like that John Cheever story, real deal love that was almost like salvation, the kind of love I was after. And I was like, he's so sweet, actually. Like he's like a very endearing, funny, like sometimes a screw up, but he still,
Yeah.
is still pursuing this kind of sweet ideal of love.
Yeah, I think that's what he kind of retains, and also why I think of it as like a coming of age story, even though he is, like 26 in the book. He's had such a sheltered background, that this is his first kind of chance to be a real adult, or to like figure out what he's about. And he is about love. Like, he is about even some of the things he rejects. He kind of says, okay, I'm rejecting all this stuff, but sometimes you reject things wholesale, and then you kind of have to pull those little bits and pieces where you're like, oh no, that really is part of my identity. And I think that Julian really does identify with the fact that people can be genuine, that you can really be in love, that people can be redeemed. I think some of those things he feels, even if he does kind of lose maybe the framework for why he believed it in the first place.
Jeff, thanks so much for joining us today. And we want to encourage all of our listeners to check out The Wait, which is available now, and we hope to read more from you in the future.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.